that enable innovations in sustainability. Our unbiased, peer-reviewed research makes critical information readily available to all. Our scholarship program fosters the next generation of researchers who will continue to provide critical research and data well into the future. We're expanding to become a data repository for everyone working toward viable, implementable solutions for a more circular economy.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Bryan Staley. I'm president of the Environmental Research and Education Foundation. We are glad you are here for one of our next installments of science sessions. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. All participants are muted, so if you have any questions for our speakers, you can ask those via the chat function. If you have a technical issue, please use the chat function as well, and an EREF staff member will assist you. To access slides from today's presentation, please take a moment to locate the handout section in the control panel. That's where you'll find a PDF available for download. And if you would like a certificate of completion, please be sure to attend the entire webinar. An email will be sent to you with a link that'll allow you to access that certificate after this webinar is over. So with that, today's topic is PFAS resource management, navigating the intersection of science and legislation. So I'd like to welcome our group of speakers today. Today we have Germain, who's Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President of Technical and Regulatory Affairs for the National Waste and Recycling Association, and has been in this industry a long time, and is one of the nationally recognized experts on a variety of different topics. We're also joined by Dr. Arie Kremen, who is a solid waste engineer and environmental scientist for over 30 years and currently works at Tetra Tech, and he's been involved in a variety of different topics across solid waste as well. And we're also joined by Sean McGinnis, who is partner at Coefficient, which is a DC-based strategic advisory firm specializing in energy, climate, environmental policy, communications, and markets. So welcome, you all. Appreciate you joining us today. What I would like to do is to start us off by just talking about the basis for some of these PFAS issues that are happening around us. I mean, obviously, this focus of this specific webinar is talking more about the intersection with PFAS and solid waste, but really the primary basis for this has been really focused on the nature of the health challenges around PFAS exposure. We certainly know that with some of the research that's been done, that PFAS is everywhere. It's been found across the globe. It's in all of our bloods. We've also seen situations where the legacy PFAS compounds have stopped being produced, and we've seen that those levels drop in the blood. However, PFAS continues to be made in large quantities, and one of the biggest challenges we see is what's the potential exposure to humans that are not fighting fires within our firefighting foam, or may not be at military bases where you have some potential significant concentrations of PFAS. But what about the rest of us in an everyday format? Where do we get those exposures, and how do the policies that are being legislated now impact the various elements of PFAS management and what should happen with that? And so with this panel of experts, I'd like to start us off perhaps with Sean, if you'd like to take this one. I mean, do you agree with the concept that the basis for policies is really this health implications, but what does that mean for policies as we move forward? I mean, do we feel like that the policies are kind of aligned with this concept of the health issues? And what are we seeing happening in that respect for the health basis versus policies that are being formed?
Yeah, thanks, Bryan, and thank you for having me. You know, the thing that I feel like I've seen is there is a significant attention on drinking water and breaking that chain of exposure. You know, at the federal level and within the states over, let's call it the last 5 years, as PFAS kind of policy has really kind of taken off and accelerated. So, you know, the driver being, you know, drinking water is a very important exposure pathway for PFAS. The policies that are kind of being shaped and coming to address that challenge That being said, though, you know, there's significant other exposure pathways that to a degree have not necessarily been overlooked, but maybe not as prioritized from a policy standpoint to address the challenge. You know, it's EPA's own assessments and other studies that have been put out are, you know, report that about 20% of a human's daily exposure is through drinking water of PFAS. So then what about the other 80%? We're talking about inhalation through indoor air and dust, food packaging. The consumption of PFAS is a significant exposure pathway, as well as dermal exposure. So as the policies have started to shape, there's definitely been a priority on addressing drinking water and the actions that kind of surround that, but we are seeing additional attention and needed attention on some of the I call it the other 80%.
Right, and that's a good point, Sean. I mean, I'm referring back to a study that was done by Harvard, which was a literature review that really kind of supports what you just stated. That's a work done by Sunderland and her group out of Harvard that did show that while the results were variable, significant exposure pathways had more to do with the packaging component, the air, the dust versus drinking water. There are certain PFAS classes that did show high levels of exposure with drinking water, but most of them were focused on these sort of non-drinking water pathways. And so it's an interesting observation. That's an area where science could really be expanded in some respects to understand that, as well as the pathways. How did that PFAS molecule get in the drinking water, for example, in the first place, or how did it get in the air? Some of that work is still ongoing. But what does that mean for the rest of us, you know, that might be getting these daily exposures versus some who are getting more chronic exposures? And there's been some work done on that front too that really kind of asks the question, you know, what are the relevant health implications over longer term, low level exposures that maybe most of us are seeing every day versus those who might be working in the firefighting realm or elsewhere. So Anne, any comments on that from your perspective?
Yeah, so looking at it from the perspective that Sean just said, a lot of the focus being on the drinking water, that probably is from the federal perspective a little bit more of where the focus is. But when you look at it from the different states, there have been a lot of states that have looked at it from packaging products and trying to implement some of these bans. Less so on the federal side, but there have been some food contact PFAS that have withdrawn voluntarily their desire to have those PFAS as acceptable food contact PFAS. So there has been some action at the federal level. It's usually not implemented by the federal government, but instead more by the PFAS manufacturers themselves. But at the state level, we're seeing a lot of product bans starting to take effect.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, you know, social media is just ripe with all kinds of information around PFAS. And, you know, we're seeing it at home. If I see another commercial around, you know, military-based contamination, you know, I would get rich if I got a nickel for every ad I see on this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of information flying around. You know, I think that begs the question, is this all correct information? Is it information that perhaps is steeped in misinformation, disinformation, or misconceptions? And so talk to me a little bit about what misconceptions that you all are seeing based on the information that you have in front of you and kind of what you're hearing. Are there some big ones out there that people should be mindful of that perhaps may not be true or maybe doesn't have enough information behind it that would really support those kind of statements? Any thoughts from you on that? And why don't we start back with you?
Yeah, so I was going to say, looking at it from the landfill perspective, you know, I think one of the things that we think a lot about is landfills have been implicated in a lot of the maps that show where PFAS have gotten out into the environment. But most of those landfills that they show on those maps, they're not existing Subtitle D, RCRA, you know, lined landfills. Those are old, closed out dump sites. And the fact that, you know, we in the industry have been so sensitive about the whole distinction that we make between, you know, what an MSW landfill is versus an old dump site, that's not necessarily included in some of the old language. So when they refer to landfills, they might be referring to some of those old sites that had no groundwater protection, and as a result, some of the high, perhaps concentrated PFAS material that they got from some of the manufacturers that got into the groundwater there did lead to some groundwater contamination. So I think there's this perception that landfills are the source of PFAS into the environment. And not only that, but I think people feel like because it's a source into the environment, that they've seen maps that show that's also their exposure to it. And of course, there's nothing further from the case. Your exposure to PFAS is almost never from landfills. And I think, we did a nice graphic that showed, what the exposure is for the average person from, thank you. So we not only show that the concentrations of PFAS in leachate is significantly lower than the concentrations you would be exposed to from actually dealing with the packaging or products themselves, but your degree of exposure, whether it's a first degree direct exposure or whether it's indirect exposure or more than 1 degree of separation. And, that's one of the things that we really wanted to highlight was that it's the concentrations are significantly lower, and then the exposure route is significantly different.
And that's a good point. Oh, just one quick note before we get to you, Sean. I was just going to point out this fact sheet too. I remember reviewing this before it went public, and the references that this graph is based off of are based on some very good peer-reviewed articles. And so this is steeped in sound science in terms of what you're pointing out. And go ahead, Sean. You had something to add.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. To a point that Ann made, over these past 5 years, communications, education on sources of PFAS has been very important. And there has been a misconception that landfills are generators of PFAS. And I think it's really important to point out that landfills do not produce or use PFAS. They are a passive PFAS receiver. And you might think, okay, what is a passive PFAS receiver? We're talking about essential public services, critical community infrastructure. This includes drinking water, wastewater, biosolids management, municipal solid waste landfills, and composting facilities. So it's in all of these, the solid waste and water sector is absolutely interdependent and operationally, critically reliant upon each other, and communities are reliant upon these services. So sort of, continuing to talk and educate around sources of PFAS and the role of passive PFAS receivers among this complex challenge has been something that even from a policy development standpoint has been pretty critical.
Yeah, great point. Arie, what are your thoughts on misconceptions? What are you seeing out there?
I think what Ann started off with was a large misconception that's propagated not only in the public, but I also see this picked up by regulators in different states. That yes, it's easy to focus on a solid waste landfill, to lose the distinction or not being considering the distinction between lined and unlined landfills, not accepting the fact that yes, there is a landfill that has a baseline, has containment, and it's isolated from the environment, and then trying to make a connection to yes, contact transfer from HDPE liners research into that's the source. I think there's almost an attempt to find and link landfills stronger to the PFAS issue than there are. And this is something that I see that is not only by the public, that's happening by the public, but I see this also by regulators.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting point, that landfills are essentially part of the solution, and that's not just mere opinion. I mean, that's something that the EPA has come out with as one of a possible number of disposal routes for PFAS, right? I mean, that kind of gets us into the federal policy landscape, but I know the EPA has through their interim guidance suggested that landfills be one of those potential modes of disposal, if you will, for PFAS. But I know that's potentially changing. Sean, do you want to kick us off with kind of what's happening at the federal level with policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And you just hit on one of them, and I think we'll talk more about that. To put this into context, over the last 3 presidential administrations, there has been a focus on PFAS, and it's only been expanding. And under the current administration, the Biden administration has a whole of agency response that's guided by its PFAS strategic roadmap. The White House has a whole of government response to PFAS as well, and there's a number of agencies that are taking action. And within the White House is interagency task force that's sort of kind of playing a quarterback role to all of the policy making across the government. But for those that are on the line, I think there's a few near-term, very key regulatory actions that everybody needs to be aware of, specifically as it relates to the solid waste. The first is EPA's proposed Circle of Hazardous Substances designation for PFOA and PFOS, which will further activate EPA's Superfund cleanup program. Second, a lot of focus and conversation on EPA's role in setting national drinking water standards, regulations for certain PFAS. And this includes a proposed rule that has been out for comment and is supposed to be finalized before the end of this year. EPA has said that they are, dead set on December 2023 to make this rule final, and that includes setting maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, for drinking water for PFOA and PFOS at 4 ppt. And this 4 ppt is the lowest detection level readily approved by EPA's analytical methods to detect. So it's as low as they can possibly get. Within the proposed rule, I would note that they set a maximum contaminant level goal of 0. But once you start factoring in the economics and technical feasibility, they set the lowest detection at 4 ppt. I would also highlight that EPA is proposing national effluent limits or pretreatment standards for various discharges of PFAS and wastewater to POTWs. And this also includes a recent announcement earlier this year that EPA is going to take action on landfill leachate and its discharge and inclusion of PFAS. And they conducted a detailed study over the course of the year, and they said that it is warranted. On that front, I would point out, based on sort of EPA's current capacity and resources, funding levels, and its own schedule, they have prioritized the chemical manufacturers and the electro metal platers to take those rulemakings that we're going to see likely before the end of 2024. So when you kind of align all of this, I don't readily see EPA starting a rulemaking as it relates to landfill leachate to probably 2025, mid 2025, possibly at the earliest. A couple other actions just real quick that I would highlight, and Brian, you mentioned one of them. The National Defense Authorization Act many years ago required EPA to create this draft interim destruction and disposal guidance. That guidance has since been put out, and Congress required EPA to update that guidance every 3 years. So before the end of this year, the EPA is required and set to release updated guidance. Within that guidance, as you mentioned, is pretty much sort of a hierarchy of disposal and destruction options. And related to that, and a very important data point, I think we could get into it. I'll just hit it quickly though, then we can go a little bit deeper in a second, is Department of Defense has just recently released its own destruction and disposal guidance based on EPA's, as required by also the National Defense Authorization Act. And that was just released, and also then gives us sort of maybe a little bit of a preview of what EPA's otherwise updated guidance at the end of the year might look like. Lastly, and then I'll stop speaking, is one other action that is going to likely get proposed this month. Could happen, in the next 7 days. EPA is looking to propose a rule as it relates to RCRA. RCRA hazardous constituent listing. So I highlight the word constituent. This is not a full hazardous waste listing. The constituent listing was based off a petition by the governor in New Mexico asking EPA to move forward with a RIPA rulemaking, which will otherwise provide the authority and clarity for the state's EPA to address PFAS as part of the RIPA corrective action program, and the state's ability to monitor and follow through on corrective action with sites like Department of Defense. So that's sort of a very quick landscape on some of the regulatory actions at the federal level that we're seeing underway.
And what I find interesting about this summary, Sean, is that some of these things really intersect into some active areas of scientific research, for example, especially around the detection side of things. I mean, the threshold of 4 parts per trillion, there's been a number of research institutions actively working on a number of different fronts. One, how can we accurately measure at such low concentrations? And in some cases, and the detection limits are getting better since this whole PFAS issue came up with the detection equipment, but there's certainly no sort of field applicable instrument that you could go and kind of handhold and drop some liquid in there, and then you get a PFAS concentration. So a lot of this stuff has to be based off of some rather heavy lab-based analytical equipment to make it happen. But the other facet of this sort of gap of research that still needs to mature more is the idea of cross-contamination. I mean, at these low levels, you've got this PFAS in the environment. It becomes an issue with, is this a real number, or is this cross-contamination happening? Either it's from the environment, or maybe someone forgot and sampled from a Teflon section of tubing or something like that, where you've got that kind of thing. So, you know, that's another active area that has potential implications on how accurate some of this monitoring would ultimately be at such low levels. No doubt it's going to improve over time. But the other part of this is just acknowledging that we're talking PFOA and PFOS for the MCL. I mean, these are the legacy compounds that are really disappearing compared to the other PFAS compounds, the thousands of other PFAS compounds, most of which we can't even detect well with current instrumentation. So there's a pretty significant gap there that no doubt will need to be addressed moving forward as well. But with that, what other kinds of things are happening with on the federal level that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so let me interject real quick there. Your comment about this being targeted at PFOA and PFAS. Obviously, all the different pieces of regulation have targeted those two. I will say that the drinking water guidelines also included 4 others. There's a hazard index that's included for the 4 others, PFNA, PFBA, and I think PFHXS, and Gen X as well. So with those 4, it's like they have either 10 parts per trillion, 9 parts per trillion, or 2,000 parts per trillion. You divide your concentration by that, sum it all up, and if you're less than 1, you're acceptable. But other than that, if it's greater than 1 for your hazard index for those 4, then you've exceeded the MCL. So this would also be an enforceable MCL on those 4. And then as far as the circular designation for the circular hazardous substances, while that rule, proposed rule was released last October, earlier this year, EPA also released an ANPRM asking for what additional PFAS should be added as circular hazardous substances. And I think we can look to this drinking water rule to kind of figure out which PFAS they'll probably be targeting. And to your point about there being, I mean, obviously at last count, depending on what you count as a PFAS, I think there's, you know, we're at over 10,000. I think there's test methods for, like, you know, at least in landfill leachate, 40. So there is definitely a pretty large gap. And so how do you determine what the remaining amount is always an interesting calculus.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it kind of goes back to the impetus behind all of this is health implications. If we can't even detect those thousands of other compounds, yet those are the ones being manufactured day in and day out today versus, a number of years ago. What are the health implications of that? It's definitely a very dynamic landscape. And I think what you and Sean have illustrated, and Arie, is that that things are happening fast on the policy front, and certainly things are also happening fast on the research front to an extent, but research wheels seem to turn pretty slow, at least with this particular topic, relative to the policy implications. So being able to keep up with that has been certainly a challenge from the research side of things. But this kind of brings us, so we talked, well, Sean, is there anything else on the federal policy before we move to state? I didn't want to move on if you had another couple points to make.
Well, it's something you just said that relates to what we just saw out of Department of Defense and their interim guidance on destruction and disposal, and the gaps with science and the research that's still needed. So DoD just recently put out their own guidance. They are going to update this guidance annually. And, in what they released, communicated that they worked very closely, coordinated with US EPA on getting this guidance out. Similar to EPA's draft guidance, we see some similarities. DoD has identified 4 commercially available options to otherwise destroy or dispose of PFAS containing material. And the guidance itself in the very back, if folks missed this, is a decision tree. It's an if-then scenario, yes or no, which leads you down this path of what they recommend for disposal or destruction. And at the very top is carbon reactivation units. As you can imagine, DoD is doing quite a bit on the drinking water treatment side, but also just since putting out this guidance, made some announcements as it relates to groundwater and pumping and treating that groundwater, and the recommendation is to use these reactivation units as sort of at the top. In the middle, you have hazardous waste landfills and solid waste landfills. On the solid waste side, it clearly articulates composite liners, gas and leachate collection treatment systems. And then the fourth option that's recognized is the hazardous waste incinerators. And this is kind of getting back to the science side. EPA, in follow-up to the DoD releasing this, put out a desk statement that just recognized on the hazardous waste incinerator side that in their view, the science is still very premature. There is scientific gaps that really kind of aligns what we saw in the draft guidance nearly 3 years ago that they've put out. That there is uncertainty and additional research needed on the thermal and incineration side. So the reason I say that is once we look forward to this updated guidance out of EPA, they kind of made it clear that not a whole lot has progressed on closing that gap as it relates to emissions. And then lastly, I would say with the DoD guidance, they do recognize that on a site-by-site basis that there is consideration for on-site storage, but also underground deep well injection. But then also they have a category that kind of talks about all of these existing and developing destruction and treatment technologies that we all are hearing about, things like supercritical water oxidation that are being deployed from a pilot standpoint. And they've sort of said, we can consider these things even before considering hazardous waste incineration. So that's sort of the dynamics of what we saw, and I think it's a pretty probably good preview to what we're going to see out of EPA at the end of this year.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, yeah, the train keeps rolling on that, but let's move on to the state actions, because we I don't want to run out of time for these other ones, and I think, Ann, you were going to talk to us about some of the state implications as well.
Sure. So, from a state action perspective, as I said, while the federal government hasn't really been implementing any product bans, there have been quite a number of product bans that have been implemented in various states. California probably taking the lead, but Maine, we have Washington State has also taken some efforts to ban PFAS from consumer products. So, this could be anything from textiles to cosmetics, personal care products. Children's products are often isolated and targeted. And when you think about ski wax, I mean, obviously that's if it's got PFAS in it, it's just designed to immediately go into the water systems as it comes off the bottoms of your skis. So clearly something that has been focused on. And then the obvious target, AFFF, to the degree that it can be removed, and mosquito control products has also been another item that's been targeted. Besides product bans, they have looked to also provide support for communities that might have been exposed to PFAS, either through blood tests or additional health support. This could also include firefighters that might have had some extra exposure beyond what the general public has experienced. To a lesser degree, states have looked at establishing MCLs, mostly for drinking water, because the timeline from the federal perspective has taken so much longer than many of them anticipated. So some of the states just went ahead and implemented their own drinking water standards for MCLs. Now, if their MCLs are below what the federal MCLs that are adopted are, chances are that their MCLs would stay in control. But I don't think, and it's on the next screen, I don't think any of them are below the 4 parts per trillion. A lot of them went for the 70 parts per trillion because that's what EPA's health advisory back in 2016 said, and then the updated health advisory obviously had much lower levels. So if you look at this, we have 9 states that have drinking water MCLs. 2 of them also have groundwater MCLs, Michigan and Vermont, and you can see that not a single one of them reaches the 4 parts per trillion. So assuming that remains in effect once we get to the final rule, when it's released later on this year, we can expect that that would take precedence over these. But what you can see that isn't necessarily applicable is that some of them went beyond the ones that were targeted by EPA. So EPA had 6 targeted, and while most of them are included in this list, none of them included PFHPA, but I think the rest of them were included in the list. Another thing that we're seeing increasingly targeted is compostable packaging, and I like to use the California rule as an example. So California, if you have compostable packaging, you can't have intentionally added PFAS. And what they use as the determinant is you can't exceed 100 parts per million of fluorine. So they don't actually measure individual PFAS, they just measure fluorine as a surrogate for all of PFAS, and then they establish 100 parts per million. Now clearly 8 orders actually of magnitude greater than some of these individual PFAS, but chances are that those PFAS aren't ones that are targeted for regulation in other scenarios. In Maine, they banned land application of biosolids due to PFAS contamination. And the story here, if you're not familiar with it, is very sympathetic. And so you can easily see how this could happen somewhere. There were small farmers, dairy farmers, that whose milk was pulled off the shelves because they tested positive for PFAS. They determined that the source of the PFAS in their dairy cows was from hay that had been grown from land that had biosolids application. So as a result, Maine has elected to ban land application of biosolids. They also looked at what they could do. Right now, across the country, 40% of all biosolids do end up in landfills, MSW landfills. So interestingly, I think it's like about an even split, 40% land application, 40% MSW landfills, and then the remaining 20% either incineration or some other mechanism. So in Maine, 100% landfill. They were going to send it to the state-owned landfill, but there wasn't enough bulking agents available in the states to ensure a stabilized facility. So a lot of it ended up going out of state, particularly to Canada. So as a result, the state has made some modification to the rule, not to allow land application, but instead to allow some import of other waste materials that can be used as bulking agents. I think that's going to be for 1 year, and then they'll have to revisit this subject again next year. But because Maine took this approach, I know a lot of other states have started looking at whether it's feasible to ban biosolids from land application. So certainly something that's of strong interest to the wastewater community.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think everybody is looking to Maine and saying what's going on there, and is there something that can be looked at from the biosolids point of view? And you know, let's stick with biosolids for a minute, because I'm curious to get Arie's take on this, because we, as we track the science of this, there was a recent paper that came out from the University of Florida, I think back in March, that showed that PFAS compounds are used in the toilet paper manufacturing process, and so they traced back significant concentrations of PFAS in biosolids back to toilet paper of all things, we found what was found is that in most cases that the PFAS concentrations are coming from this sort of toilet paper manufacturing process. And so, Arie, I'm curious to get your take on PFAS in biosolids. I mean, how much of an issue is this relative to other PFAS sources that might go to landfill? To Ann's point, there's a lot of biosolids that end up in landfills, or that could end up, you know, being composted and end up in land application fields. What are you seeing from your point of view?
I think the point that Ann made about that the trend is 40% of the biosolids are landfill, like if this avenue for disposal, managing biosolids goes away, a lot of the burden of this will fall on landfills. And for landfills, it's a two kind of problem. It's one, it's a PFAS problem that we're here to discuss. And the second one, it's an operational and a safety issue, right? Introducing more liquids into landfill, creating potentially odor, creating products into landfill when you're located next to residential neighborhoods, which is for many facilities in the Northeast can be a problem. So the issues that with this tradition will happen, plus the most important one, it's the airspace capacity utilization rate. It's landfills are not built to take those on those quantities, and population centers are centered with very few landfilling opportunities. So that's going to be an issue of how it's going to be implemented, how it's going to affect the solid waste industry, and also then what is going to increase, because that's the feedback loop that's going to then start happening. If you landfill the biosolids, you're going to have eventually going to see larger contributions in your leachate. And even though, as we discussed before, that landfills are contributing to the solution, and by sequestering PFAS, if then some of those PFAS will go out to wastewater treatment facilities again and then come back, we will see an issue here. And some of the regulations that Sean was addressing for the effluent limitation guidelines, or Plan 15, that we anticipate coming out later this year, is going to address technologies right now to remove PFAS. So there's going to be a circular economy between landfills and wastewater treatment plants cooperating, where the discharge is happening from the landfills. It's going to be concentrated, coming out, it's going to be removed. And the technologies that we have right now for separating PFAS out of water that work very well, and that in most cases are employed, are separation technologies that create either a waste product highly concentrated in PFAS, or they're creating a media that has the PFAS absorbed, which then again, if this gets the accepted technology, is going to be the airspace consumption rate is going to go up, and the landfills will lose the airspace that is dedicated to MSW, which we're here to serve as the first place. So this PFAS treatment and cycle is going to have what the industry is very much concerned, a negative impact overall on landfills, and both on the operations and the safety and the economy.
And that's a great, maybe drill down on that a little bit. I mean, is that the main mode of preparation for landfill operators? Are they focused on are they more focused on the leachate treatment side, or are they more focused on like waste acceptance to try to minimize certain compounds from coming into landfill in the first place? Like, what are you seeing there in terms of how landfill operators are preparing for these ongoing and incoming regulations?
I think as a snapshot right now, you still see the most focus being efforts concentrated on treating leachate for PFAS and what do we have to comply with. How do we prepare for when those regulations come down, and how would it cause it? But I see more and more facilities considering what's coming into the landfill, more waste materials that are being diverted from other disposal or management solutions, looking into landfills, and operators starting to ask questions, what is in there from both the context of PFAS and other constituents, plus those materials, sometimes if they're manufactured in industrial quantities, they can overwhelm the landfill, and managing those materials that might have completely different properties and then affect how landfill will perform. So I see this burden, this is going to be shifting. I think once we know what the EPA and states are going to require from landfills for treating leachates, we're going to see an uptake, and we've seen uptake there already, that facilities are preparing, look for funding solutions, trying to find what's the best scenario in each incident. But with that, smart operators starting already asking what we're accepting and should we continue accepting that. And this is not just one of the technologies that is going to be probably part of the limitation guidelines, reverse osmosis, which is creating another concentrated waste stream that landfills also then looking for managed either on site or off site, which is again going to be heavily going to distort the economies, how they're operating. So I think there's a interconnectedness of many of those items that we've discussed, how they're coming together, both the regulations, how they will translate it, how they will be adopted by the states, and how they, at the end, the operator at the scale house needs to decide what it's going to do about that. And at the end, how it's going to pay for all those treatments and the testing that now might need to go on there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. And this brings to mind a comment, I think, Ann, that you brought up earlier, that and even looking at these state rules where it's multiple PFAS compounds being considered, how does the consideration from a policy standpoint of thinking of PFAS as like an all PFAS as a class, or specific PFAS compounds? I mean, do you see some direction there in terms of policy development? And then what's your take on how that evolution of policy may impact some of these operational considerations that Arie brings up?
So we've worked pretty closely with some of the folks at ATSWAMA, which is the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials. And one of the things that they told us was early on their approach was to suggest that PFAS be regulated as a class. But that was kind of their first take out of the starting gate. And then as they started looking into it a little bit deeper and started examining the topic a little bit further, they've evolved, and now they're at a point where they support the idea of regulating PFAS individually. There's obviously, you can see from this list typical PFAS that are the focus of most of the states, and what we frequently see that these are the ones that most often are targeted. So I don't think that there's many things that go after it as a class. That compostable packaging criteria that I cited in California is of course an exception, but if you look at the way they consider the total concentration, it's of course, as I said, we're looking at 4 parts per trillion for PFOA or PFAS, and then 100 parts per million. So I mean, you're already off 8 orders of magnitude. It's not really even considering them in the same space.
Okay, and so when you think about PFAS treatment and the direction this policy is going, in some respects, it's really a matter of are some of these treatment methods effective? And I think that there's been this ongoing conversation of, well, what happens to the PFAS during a treatment? I mean, maybe Arie, back to you real quick. I mean, is there can PFAS be destroyed with current technologies? I mean, can we get rid of it completely, or is there still some form of PFAS that's going to be with us, at least with the treatment options that are noted under the guidelines that that Sean was describing from DoD and from EPA? I mean, are we still going to deal with PFAS in some form or fashion even after quote unquote treatment occurs?
Let me take the word that you had there, completely. I think there's an engineering terms, there's no completely, number one. There's always going to be some residual that's going to be out there. But the other one that I have an issue with is not with your statement, but it's the level of things to destroy right now are very expensive and very energy intensive. And for the quantities that we would need to produce, and again, I'm talking for the solid waste industry here, to manage the volumes that we have, those technologies don't appear right now mature enough for implementation, even on a case-by-case scenario, or for upscaling if we had to bring them out massively to serve basically the entire industry. And I think that right now, until those technologies come out and then have developed and matured enough, and the economies are working out refined technologies that can work and destroy PFAS reliably to very low concentrations, I think we're right now having technologies that do separate and concentrate the PFAS, so that, more that we can rely on than that we should be looking right now in the solid waste industry, at least in my mind, for destruction. There might be other instances where destruction technologies might be more applicable. With AFFF is a very high concept, might be a really easy target. Certain remediation, maybe in water treatment, when you talk about groundwater or potable water, you might have a much more suitable matrix that you can manage with. But I think for this whole waste industry, destruction, even if incinerators is going to be a challenging one, because what I've seen recently in another research paper about what you call completely destruct, and I saw destruction levels of 99.99%. We're talking of temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Celsius, about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, with a residence time of several seconds. This is not how most of the industry is set up to deal with that.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's really interesting. Now, basically means we don't have a silver bullet yet, is what I interpret you saying. There's more work to be done on that front. And this kind of relates back to sort of costs of cleanup. And there was a study that came out recently by Minnesota, and that talked about the cost of PFAS and what the mitigation costs are. Sean, I know we had some discussion on that kind of in the pre-show. I'm curious to get your take on this particular study and what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, and I think this is a good lead into a couple points, based on some discussion that we've already had around, what are the trade-offs, right? So to just be quick, when we look at biosolids and all of the to land applying, all the greenhouse gas emission sequestration, reduction of these emissions and those types of strategies, and it being a positive amendment for our soils, as we've seen a state like Michigan do a complete ban, Maine, we're seeing states like Michigan that I think the wastewater community views as taking a smart regulatory approach as it relates to addressing PFAS and biosolids. Screening, identifying what's industrial impacted versus what's not, what can continue to be land applied. There's trade-offs there that need to be considered. From a remediation standpoint, there's groups like the Sustainable Remediation Forum that have been around for a long time that are looking at green and sustainable remediation approaches to cleanup. And I think that those principles need to likely continue to be very much applied as it relates to the concept of addressing PFAS. And Arie hit on it, the energy costs, the cost to treat to certain levels. There's a greenhouse gas component to a lot of this, and there's going to be these trade-offs. As you mentioned, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency put out sort of an eye-opening study as to what they term the exorbitant costs associated with removing and otherwise disposing or destroying PFAS from wastewater. And their projection for just the state of Minnesota for their wastewater sector is upwards to $28 billion over the next 20 years. Now, the thing that they did state in this study that I think is very eye-opening is that it costs between $1 to buy PFAS to make consumer products, there's a cost of $50 to about $1,000 per pound. That exact same cost as it relates to removing and then destroying that PFAS that was entered into commerce from a wastewater treatment plant ranges from 2.7 million and 18 million per pound. So as we've seen, these compounds have flooded the market through commerce for all of the reasons and the properties and the things that they provide to consumer products. But this really then gets down to, again, talk about these trade-offs. What is an essential use versus what is a non-essential use? We've seen some studies around this, but it seems that there is a lot more work to be done on identifying and differentiating those two so that we can start to prioritize what is not a one-size-fits-all approach to PFAS, as you mentioned, banning it as an entire class, but what's truly essential versus what's not.
Right. And that's a great point, because that distinction of non-essential versus essential, and even the concept of, I know some of the regulatory regulations are going towards the concept of sort of deliberate addition versus it's there along for the ride. It's been picked up kind of along the way. And those are certainly some distinctions that it seems future policies, as they're developing, will need to be made, because they have some ramifications as to how that might be managed in the future. In that respect, with where you all see the policy landscape right now, and where what we described with some of these studies, I mean, where do you all see some of the greatest needs as far as whether it's information or research or science? Like, where do you see that being most helpful as these policies continue to evolve? Anne, why don't we start with you?
So from our perspective, one of the things that's causing us the most agita is the potential designation of CERCLA as hazardous substances. In particular, because of the potential to implicate landfills. As Sean earlier referred to, landfills, we are passive receivers. We didn't do anything to generate them or create them, but nonetheless, we receive a lot of PFAS in our waste streams. There is the interdependence between landfills and wastewater treatment plants. As I said, 40% of biosolids do come to landfills, and I only would anticipate that number going up in the future as there might be total or partial bans. And yet there was, touched on earlier, the potential for waste acceptance criteria being implemented that would divert some of those materials for a longer distance or away from certain landfills because of their unwillingness to accept that material, as well as same thing with wastewater treatment plants. If that landfill has a wastewater treatment plant that's reluctant to take their materials, they're certainly going to be doing everything that they can to try and limit the materials. All that going back to what I was saying about CERCLA is, while we recognize that EPA is planning on coming out with ELGs that would establish the effluent limits for landfills, and we anticipate working closely with EPA to make sure that the rules move forward in a manner that is achievable. We don't see this same potential moving forward for landfills under CERCLA. CERCLA, it's been so long since we had a lot of Superfund projects there. A lot of people don't really understand Superfund. It's not a liability rule. It's, if you release materials, then you are responsible for cleaning it up, and there's no limit. There's no bottom line. There's no criteria that you can use to say that you will do it to this level. And it's also retroactive, and it's joint and several. And joint and several just means that any party that contributed to any of the release can be held 100% responsible for the cleanup. And those items just expose the entire landfill community to unacceptably high rates of liability. And if you look at the way Superfund has been implemented in the past, it usually results in a tremendous number of lawsuits. The lawyers get the vast majority of the money, and we're particularly concerned that that's going to happen again. So while we don't expect any sort of legislative solution with respect to the ELGs, we're very concerned about the potential for CERCLA, and so we are looking for some sort of regulatory solution, legislative solution, anything that can help us out with respect to trying to deal with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I know we're running up on time here, so Sean, I want to go to you as well, but I'll throw in one of our audience questions along with your response to what additional science is needed. But are there any upcoming or proposed rules, state or fed, related to air emissions? And is there anything happening there on that front?
There is, and I wish I had this in front of me. Not necessarily, well, I don't, again, I wish I had the details in front of me. There is a proposal that has been put out to update EPA, a rule associated with emissions, and what this proposed rule is doing is looking at hazardous air pollutants and the reporting requirements associated with that. That being said, in the proposal, it says that EPA is considering the potential PFAS option, they refer to it as, from a reporting standpoint. And it really specifically says that in the final rule, and the agency is seeking public input on this proposed rule right now, this air emissions reporting requirement rule. If they were to add PFAS, it's pretty specific about how they would implement it from a regulatory standpoint, and essentially adjoin it with, this isn't a hazardous air pollutant listing, but essentially saying, certain sectors are going to be required to report on hazardous air pollutants and these PFAS compounds. So that is from my knowledge, at least at the federal level, the first sort of material step that we've seen the agency consider as it relates to reporting PFAS emissions. But then you get into the next question, what method are we using? EPA is still working on analytical methods for detection as it relates to air emissions. There is nothing that has been promulgated. There's no method that is a draft method to the degree like 1633 to test for 40 compounds and things like leachate in soils and biosolids and other media. So it seems that EPA has a ways to go here. That being said, if my memory is correct, I think the implementation of that reporting rule when going final would start in 2027. So I think EPA is recognizing maybe building in a phase in of what would otherwise be needed to get to that point. But they're soliciting input right now on if that potential option should be otherwise included. At the state level, I'll make it quick. There has not been much activity other than, and maybe Ann, you can help me. I believe there's been some focus in the state of New York on air emissions with PFAS, and maybe one other state, but it's been pretty thin.
Yeah, the focus from air perspective, like Sean says, it's really small. Most of the PFAS that do go out into air, they tend to be fluorotelomeres. I'm probably saying that wrong. Fluorotelomeres. Arie can probably correct me on that, but they're not generally the PFAS that are ones of concern. So it's usually some of the other ones that generate less interest. That being said, since Sean mentioned New York, there was an interesting proposal in New York to require landfills to solidify all their leachate and handle it 100% on site, because there was a recognition that there is no possible way of destroying or removing 100% of PFAS from the leachate. So even eliminating the potential for pretreatment and saying that all of it must be managed on site. And obviously that's not something that we think is really practical or implementable. So that's something that we're probably going to be spending some time talking with the regulators and saying, expressing our thoughts on that.
Right. Right. Yeah, good point on that. And kind of going back to the landfill gas thing, one quick note, there was a question that came up, our landfill gas is being tested. I think we kind of covered that one on the research front. Just to note, there are a number of studies going on right now. It is a very new area of research, at least on the solid waste side of things, measuring PFAS compounds from landfill gas. There's some work happening at Purdue as well as North Carolina State University right now. So there are things happening, but it's still kind of early on. And so, Arie, just going to give you the last word here. Any thoughts on research efforts or information needs that we would have that could help move the needle on some of these policy actions?
An easy one is, obviously certainty that helps the industry and helps people who have to make decisions, to make company decisions. But I think what I would like to see, and we addressed it at the beginning a little bit, is that the consumer becomes involved in that. We talked about regulation, we talked about treatment, we talked about the solid waste industry, who's receiving the discarded products for management, and then creates by that a wastewater that's enriched in PFAS. But I think we need to see that the responsibility is not just limited to the solid waste industry. I think we need to make sure that the consumer gets involved with this and sees his part or their contribution to this problem and how they can help resolve it. Because I think a problem like this, that like Anne mentioned before, we can detect PFAS in Tibet and in the South Pole. It needs a little bit broader than just a point of treatment at landfills or waste treatment facilities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Well, Sean and Arie, thank you all so much for giving us your time today. We really appreciate the insight, and look forward to having you back next time as well. Just as a reminder for those of you who are participating, we will be sending out a survey later. Please take that. That will be your way to also get your certificate of attendance. Again, thanks to our great panel of speakers, and we look forward to seeing you at the next science sessions. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brian.